I certainly now can't imagine a time in the future where I won't be gardening or I won't be growing, or that my garden and all of this won't have a really important place for me. When we were looking for a house, what we knew at the time was we wanted a house that was going to be in a peaceful location, but somewhere that was going to have a garden. My partner enjoys the garden, but for me, the garden really was a big deciding factor. So when we found this place, and it's got an acre of really lovely varied gardens, we're in a part of Ireland where the soil is really good quality, and I just fell for it instantly. And I could see that the garden had already been so lovingly tended by the previous owners that it had, I suppose I always talk about it having brilliant bones. That's the big thing. But at the same time, it had the promise that there were areas that I knew straight away would be perfect for me to just get stuck in and start making the vegetable garden. So I suppose with any garden, there's good points and bad points, and there's always going to be things that make you feel really good about it and things that maybe make you feel not so good. The first challenge really is something that was also a positive, which is how mature the garden is. When we came to see it, I absolutely fell for it. But with that maturity comes a lot of work, because things were starting to get too mature, and it's meant that I've had to remove stuff already, which felt sad at the time because I feel like I'm changing the character of the garden, and yet at the same time it was very much necessary. If I'm completely truthful, the other thing that isn't so great about the garden at the moment is that I've inherited some problems, I suppose, that I need to clear up. One of the biggest is the boundary hedging. Almost all of the garden is surrounded by really huge Leyland cypress hedges, which give us great privacy and lots of shelter, but they are also a bit of a menace. And working on them to try and get them reduced in height, and in some cases removed completely, is just either a very expensive job or a job that takes a lot of effort. And I'm trying to do a lot of it myself. So that has come at quite a cost in terms of my energy levels, but I can see that I'm starting to make progress. So I don't hold any formal horticultural qualifications. When I left school, that's what I started to train in. I went to horticulture college with the plan that I would get a degree in horticulture. And in the end, as much as I enjoyed it, I left after the first year and instead pursued a very different career. So since then, gardening has very much just been something that brings me a lot of happiness. I did do the first year, so I learned quite a lot of the foundation work that is needed when you're really building up your horticultural experience. Things like productive growing and a lot of growing around amenity plantings as well. Everything else I know has either been self-taught or taught by my friends and my family. I remember my mum planting up a vegetable garden, and in fact we have some brilliant little photos of me going up and down the garden on a tricycle next to the vegetable garden. And I remember it having, like planks of wood so that you could get through in between, and we had some beds that had, I suppose, there were some rows of carrots and some rows of peas and things like that. But then for my grandparents, they had a lovely garden, but what they had and what I loved was a greenhouse. But their greenhouse really only had strawberries in it. Having it dedicated to strawberries meant that we just had the most amazing harvests every year. And I remember being sent up as a little 3 or 4 year old with a plastic bowl to go toddling up the garden to go and collect fresh strawberries. I'm obviously biased, but I think they're the best tasting strawberries ever. And in fact, I now have those strawberries in my polytunnel, keeping that going. Really, it's only until taking on this garden that I've really been able to get stuck into gardening proper, I suppose. In the past, I would have dabbled in the gardens that I had in rental houses, but this is now really where I've been able to concentrate my efforts, and that's been brilliant, because up until now I would say I wouldn't have been a year-round gardener. I would have been a fair weather gardener, but now that's changing. Partly it's changing because I have a channel, so I want to keep making content through the year for everybody and prove to people, as well as myself, that gardening is truly year-round. And part of it is just that a garden this size takes a lot of work, and I can't really afford to take a break for as long as the late autumn going through the winter and into the early spring. So for the last couple of years, I have now been gardening all year round. The first year particularly, I wouldn't say I was growing all year round, and what I was doing instead was working on a lot of the structure. Last winter, I started a lot of the prep work to make the veg garden here, getting hold of all of the sleepers in the wood, getting them cut to size, getting the topsoil so that I could get all of that infrastructure put in place. And one of the other huge jobs that I had to do last winter was removing a lot of the older trees. We have some old fruit trees that were diseased and they were casting shade into this area. I see each year now a shift where I'm moving more and more into an all year round gardening mentality, I suppose. I'm doing sort of hard landscaping work during the winter, whereas I think this winter I'm going to take that another step now and look at growing to kind of keep things moving all the way through the year. So at the very start of this year, when really I was trying to gear up to all of the growing, both here in the veg garden and down in the polytunnel, I kind of set myself a bit of a challenge, which was to see how far along the self-sufficiency homesteading journey I could go. Realistically, I've always come at it from a point of view that I don't think I can ever be fully self-sufficient. I can't see myself turning this place into a homestead. I have a career that's separate to this, that's important to me, and it takes a lot of my time, and I'm not sure about the element of raising animals and all of that and having to really rely fully on myself for all of our food needs. That said, I do think that I would like to increasingly move towards being self-sufficient in seasonal fresh fruit and veg, and this year has given me a real taste of that. So although this has been my first year, I've been really quite pleased that even though I was planting things very late because of timings, I have actually managed to do without having to buy things like potatoes, tomatoes, salads, all sorts of things like that I haven't had to buy from the supermarket for months. And what that's really shown me is that if I can start to develop what would be quite a strong system of growing, that although I won't be fully self-sufficient, I think I can be maybe quite sufficient, and certainly somewhere along that journey. The other thing I think is that rather than making it the end goal and then potentially disappointing myself, what I'm going to try to do is I'm going to say that I'm going to work towards that, and I'll see how far along that journey I get, and I'm just going to enjoy each year seeing whether I can push that further and further, and who knows what 3 years, 5 years, 10 years looks like. Hopefully what it looks like is a lot of nice homegrown food. So really, veg gardening is fairly new to me. I did a certain amount of productive growing when I was in college because it was what we were being taught. That is a very long time ago now, longer than I would they'd care to remember. It's nearly 20 years ago now. And since then, I suppose a lot of my enjoyment would have lain in growing ornamentals, and certainly more along the ornamental side of gardening. And it's only in the last couple of years where I've really started to get interested in growing my own stuff. Then there's the obvious thing that as you start getting harvests, it starts to get quite addictive. And certainly the more I've been getting out of this patch, even just in the last few months, the more I've wanted to keep growing. And certainly I've found that I'm thinking more and more at the minute when it comes to my gardening about gardening to grow stuff that's going to be productive rather than stuff that's purely going to be ornamental. Gardening has always been ever present in my life, and it's always been important. And I think for me, I found that it's one of the constants that I always come back to. Now that I'm dedicating a lot more time to it, I'm finding it a really just a really, really valuable thing for me and for, well, my well-being. And I know that well-being is a term that gets used a huge amount now, but it is really important because what I see is that our jobs are becoming increasingly virtual as well as stressful. So we're spending more time in front of computers, we're not meeting people face to face, and particularly we're spending time indoors. And I know that that's something that I have to be very careful of, is that I can quite easily fall into just wanting to be indoors all the time. And I find that having the garden and having it needing me so that it can be tended forces me out. And being out, being connected with the plants, being connected with the soil, and growing things that are either going to look nice or smell nice or taste good or keep me from being hungry, all of those things, it's a kind of gratification. Getting that back is just really, really powerful for me. And I find that it is a big de-stressor, partly from being outside and partly because it does quite often just need a lot of your attention and a lot of your thinking. You know, you might be looking at the garden and thinking, how am I going to fix this? Or that's going to take a lot of work. And you realize that in the time it's taken you to sort something, it's maybe taken an hour, it's maybe taken 2 hours, but in that time, rather than focusing on a task that's maybe for, I don't know, a large organization, you're focusing time on something that, as well as being for the garden and for the environment, really is for you. And that's why I love it. This has been a transition that's taken me quite a few years to get to this point, but it's going to stay. It's just really important to me now.